Okay, so we will go ahead and get started. It is my great pleasure to introduce T.A. McDonald, who will be our speaker today. She is a research instructor of neurology at Vanderbilt University Medical Center, specializing in autism research, with the goal to optimize outcomes for individuals on the autism spectrum across the lifespan. Dr. McDonald applies an interdisciplinary life course approach to her intervention and measure research. Dr. McDonald currently participates in the NIH, NHL, BI, Vanderbilt Scholars in T4 Translational Research K-12 program. She is regularly invited to present her work at national and international conferences and meetings. Prior to her current position, Dr. McDonald completed a postdoctoral fellowship at VUMC under the mentorship of Dr. Beth Mallow, focused on optimizing the health and well-being for adults with autism spectrum disorder. She earned her PhD in 2016 from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, engaging a variety of disciplines to study autism spectrum disorders. Her dissertation examined how identity mediates stigma and stereotype threat on post-secondary outcomes of education, employment, and well-being for adults on the autism spectrum. Dr. McDonald also earned her MS in psychology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and she received her BS in psychology from Cal State University, Long Beach. She has collaborated on several autism research projects and publications with researchers from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Prior to joining the Vanderbilt Kennedy Center, she served as co-chair for the Wisconsin Community of Practice for Autism Spectrum and Other Developmental Disorders and volunteered with the Atlanta Autism Consortium. And without further ado, we are very excited to introduce Dr. T.A. McDonald.
Thank you, everyone, for the warm welcome, and thank you for being here. Today, I'm going to discuss the broader autism phenotype Constellations-Disability matrix paradigm, which is a unifying model to explain the nature and increased prevalence of autism based on genetics, assortative mating, and developmental plasticity. Science is still grappling with the big questions of autism, and these include: what is autism? Why is it so heterogeneous? Why is the prevalence changing? And these three questions, the way that we look for answers and the answers that we find, have implications for what we should do about autism. The prevalence of autism has increased dramatically over the years, from 1 in 5,000 in 1975 to 1 in 54 in 2020. And the causes for these increases are unknown. However, there are several current theories regarding the prevalence increases in autism. One theory involves the changes in diagnostic criteria. Without going into great detail, I'm going to review a brief timeline. Autism was first introduced in 1980 in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM. And this is the resource that's used by psychiatrists and psychologists to diagnose individuals with developmental and psychiatric disorders that do not have a known biological cause. There were several subcategories under the umbrella term pervasive developmental disorder. Then, in order to improve the diagnostic descriptions, these subcategories were revised in 1987 to autistic disorder and pervasive developmental disorder, not otherwise specified, which is a long way of saying similar to autistic disorder, but milder or a little different. In 1994, several more categories were added, including Asperger's syndrome, which some of you may have heard of. In 2000, Rett syndrome was removed because of its known biological origin. And then finally, in 2013, the umbrella term of pervasive developmental disorder and all of the subcategories were removed and replaced with the umbrella term autism spectrum disorder with 3 levels of support. I'm going to talk about this last definition more later, but notice that the rates of autism have continued to climb well past 2013. One of the theories of prevalence change involves the idea of diagnostic substitution. And this is the idea that before autism was well known, individuals would have met criteria for let me say this differently. Individuals that would have met criteria for autism today would have met the criteria for some other diagnosis for the time, such as intellectual disability, or what used to be called mental retardation, specific language disability, possibly a different developmental disability, or schizophrenia. So if this is the case, we should see a corresponding decrease in prevalence within these other diagnostic groups. However, that has not been the case. For example, while the prevalence of intellectual disabilities has fluctuated somewhat over time, it has on average remained, pretty constant, while the rates of autism have risen steadily. There was some controversy regarding diagnostic substitution over different time periods, but this was partly due to short snapshots in time and flawed tracking systems, including, loss of tracking data and some other methodological concerns. But when Neville and Blaxell addressed these concerns and utilized a constant age tracking, it becomes even easier to see that the prevalence of autism has increased while the prevalence of intellectual disabilities has remained relatively constant. This is true for autism in comparison with other diagnoses as well. Certainly, substitution and greater awareness account for some percentage of the increase in autism rates, but these do not account for the majority of the increases. Currently, there's no consensus regarding the mechanisms that underlie increases in autism prevalence. Autism is currently defined as a person having issues in two major areas. The first involves persistent deficits, delays, and differences in social communication skills. And the second involves restricted, repetitive behaviors, interests, and activities. And the ways that these can present across individuals can look a lot of ways. It can include difficulties with social and emotional give and take, or nonverbal communication. It can also involve difficulties with developing, maintaining, or understanding relationships. People can show unusual motor movements, or have an insistence on routines, or be very focused on specific interests, or present with unusual sensory behaviors. I'd like to bring your attention to the fact that the DSM uses deficit-based definitions. There are no positive attributes included in the DSM or ICD, which is the international resource. So none of those include positive descriptions of autism. Also, the current definition of the broader autism phenotype is simply milder symptoms of autism. Instead of the subcategories used in previous versions, the current DSM describes levels of support based on symptoms. So if a person presents with severe deficits in social communication and very limited social interactions, they would be described as needing level 3 support. Level 2 would include someone with marked deficits and limited social interaction, while level 1 support describes someone who has noticeable impairments if they're not supported, and people with difficult or decreased interest in engaging in social interactions. Similarly, level 3 support is needed for someone with extreme difficulty coping with change, and other levels of support describing individuals requiring decreasing levels of support. And so by now, you're probably noticing that there is a lot of variation across individuals on the autism spectrum. And in fact, explaining the great heterogeneity is one of the biggest challenges in autism. Stephen Shore, a famous self-advocate, is quoted as saying that if you've seen one person with autism, you've seen one person with autism. And that is because there is wide variation in the strengths and challenges we see across autistic individuals. It's demonstrated in those 3 levels of support that I talked about. It's also demonstrated in the range of strengths that people on the autism spectrum display. Currently, there is very little research on strengths in autism. But this idea between difference and disability is reflected in the labels, such as those with Asperger's versus autism, or high-functioning autism versus low-functioning autism. And what about scientists or engineers, artists, musicians, and others? Where is the line between disability and difference, or between level 1 support and, say, level 0? So one of the biggest challenges in autism is explaining the heterogeneity of traits. Currently, no prior theory adequately accounts for the wide spectrum of challenges and strengths in autism, and what I'm going to talk about as BAPCO. Most of the research on the genetics of autism is trying to figure out what is the cause of autism, what are the mechanisms that lead to an individual having the characteristics present in autism. What we do know is that autism is a complex interaction between genes and environment. It's highly heritable. The concordance rate between identical twins is 98%. The concordance rate between fraternal twins is 67% for autism and 53% for the broader autism phenotype. Single genes have been identified that are highly predictive of an autism diagnosis. And these mostly consist of de novo mutations, which are not usually inherited, or rare inherited gene variants. These account for about 30% of autism cases, and most of these are associated with a low nonverbal IQ. And the majority of individuals on the autism spectrum do not have an intellectual disability. But I want to emphasize the fact that no single genetic factor results in 100% of recipients receiving autism. For example, in Fragile X, 60% of individuals from this population meet criteria for an autism diagnosis, leaving 40% who do not. So this means that the genetic variants are highly predictive, but are not a definitive cause of autism. So I mentioned that the monogenic factors account for about 30% of the variance in autism. However, the vast majority of autism heritability comes through common genetic variants, through these single nucleotide polymorphisms. And these are the genes that account for most of the genetic variants in people. So everything, your eye color, your hair color, your height, your regulatory genes, your metabolic system. There are a large number of these SNPs that predict autism or occur at a higher rate in autism, but each of these have very small effect sizes. However, these SNPs can cluster or occur together, and we have computational algorithms that detect how several different SNPs that predict autism can form clusters that collectively predict autism with greater effect sizes. It's a growing field, and right now it's unclear how these clusters are working, or what these nexuses mean. Some of the SNPs code for, really odd things like copper sensitivity. But the majority, we don't know yet what they're coding for or how they're operating in relation to autism. Like I said, this continues to be a growing field, but there is an odd thing that's shown up with this type of research, and that is that the polygenic risk score for autism, that cluster of genes that are associated with autism for those that do not have a co-occurring disability, that a higher polygenic risk score is associated with higher parental education attainment and IQ. And this is very odd because it runs opposite from that of other disorders. Most other neurodevelopmental disorders decrease with socioeconomic status. Sociologically, this relationship, we know from a diagnostic point of view that this relationship has existed. And sociologically, this has been explained as evidence of social capital, that people who have greater social attainment have more social or financial resources to obtain a diagnosis. But this relationship then should not be present with the polygenetic risk scores. In addition to genetic factors, there are also environmental factors, and these run a gamut. They include, and I'm going to talk a lot more about these later, but these include maternal and paternal factors, health and nutrition, environmental toxins and pathogens, illness, prenatal or postnatal trauma, and other factors. But I want to emphasize that the twin studies demonstrate the genetic link is stronger than the environmental link. That said, environmental factors may contribute to individual genetic vulnerability and development in autism. So a portion of my work focuses on reconceptualizing the broader autism phenotype. The rest of this presentation is going to focus on what I call the broader autism phenotype constellations, or BAPCO. If you recall, the broader autism phenotype and autism were defined by specific disabilities relating to social interaction, communication, and unusual behavior. Instead, I am going to shift our attention to socially valued traits that I propose underlie autism, and actually underlie those other characteristics that were described in the DSM. So these are socially valued traits, such as sustained attention, increased memory, systemizing, object orientation, nonconformity, and sensory differences. And these are all considered non-disabling traits. Many of these are considered beneficial traits. But I'm going to describe ways that these traits, individually or in combination, with extreme expression or in constellations, can interfere with developmental timing, and the ways that I'm going to also describe the ways that they can interact with the developmental timing of co-occurring disabilities. And these traits exist in varying levels across cultures. The parameters of these traits in a population are influenced by de novo mutations, natural selection, genetic drift, and non-random mating. So for this talk, I'm going to focus on assortative mating and these BAPCO traits. Assortative mating is a non-random form of mating where members choose mates with similar traits. And this requires the salience of these traits. They have to be detectable. When people engage in assortative mating, it can change the frequency that traits are represented in the population. It can also increase the rate of change of those frequency of traits in the population. Cultural environments can affect assortative mating by increasing or decreasing the salience of traits in the environment, or the social value of specific traits. Cultural environments can also affect people's ability or freedom to select mates based on traits. And as an aside, even planned marriages, with matchmakers can result in similar outcomes if matches are being made based on similarity of traits. So now I'm going to talk about the social factors related to assortative mating for BAPCO traits in the United States. And this is the model for my theoretical paradigm, and it is a lot to take in all at once. So we're going to go through this in small chunks, starting with the historic education and occupational opportunities for males and females. I'm going to talk about assortative mating and how that can lead to BAPCO personalities. So there have been some really radical changes in our education systems over the last 100 years. Over 100 years ago, compulsory education was not universal in the United States for elementary school. In fact, access to high school was not universally available until the mid-40s. There's also been a shift away from social promotion, where people are promoted from grade to grade for social reasons, like their age or their cohort, in favor of merit promotion, where grade promotion is dependent on demonstrated competencies, such as like reading or math. In this way, schools from elementary school on up through higher education become environments that sorted people based on specific skills relating to things like memory, attention, systemizing, object orientation, and a host of other skills. And when I say, sort here, I mean that these traits become more salient due to the social values related to education attainment. We've also had extraordinary changes in our employment opportunities since the US became a country. There has been increased freedom to choose one's occupation, their career or their level of education attainment. And these are due to fewer limits related to social class and parental occupation. So in essence, the son of a shoemaker is not destined to become a shoemaker. Over time, men in particular have been able to choose from a widening range of occupations. And one's choice of a career or occupation is a salient signal of traits. It can signal one's abilities and preferences. In this way, the traits of engineers may be quite different than the traits of entertainers. And the traits of someone successful in data entry might be quite different from somebody who excels at waiting tables or bartending. And these occupations and preferences influence where we work and live, our hobbies and recreational activities that we choose to engage in, our social communities, and our partners for offspring. And these influences affect who meets whom and catalyzes potential for phenotypic subgroups. And BAPCO is likely one of many subgroups. Women, on the other hand, have only more recently experienced freedoms related to occupation and career. In the not so distant past, women were expected to marry and perform domestic services. Their employment opportunities were limited and often were restricted to domestic services such as tailoring, caring for children. This meant that women could choose from many salient traits in men, but men could only choose from a small number of salient traits in women. With the increase of women's freedom to choose their occupations, careers, and education attainment, came also the ability for men to select women based on a greater number of similar salient traits. Which again, these traits that she's able to now engage in through work and hobbies and all kinds of things affects where she lives and who she meets. And this dual-sided assortative mate selection can result in dramatic increases in frequency and intensity of traits in a population. So when men and women, or more specifically here, males and females, are meeting each other based on these socially valued traits that are being selected for by education and occupational abilities and preferences, and I'm talking about these very specific traits, it can lead to offspring that have a range of these traits. They may have all of these traits, or they may have specific constellations of these traits. They may have offspring with greater intensity of one or more of these traits. And these intense traits and specific combinations may have different effects on development. All right, so I've talked about the historical factors relating to occupation and education for men and women and how that relates to assortative mating, which can lead to offspring with BAPCO personalities. Now I'd like to walk us through the top part of this model. So I'm going to talk about how these BAPCO personalities, when intensified, can affect development in ways that may lead to autism. So let's talk about BAPCO traits and child development. I'm going to start with sensation and perception because all attention is filtered through the sense and perceptual systems. Children with strong BAPCO personalities may have strong preferences for attending to sensory and perceptual information. They may have heightened or dampened awareness. These are traits we can see in people who become super tasters, those people who can detect all the little ingredients in food. Or it may be others who require a lot of sensory input for it to register. These are individuals that can have unusual sensory experiences. For example, there are some people who see colors when they hear sound. Others have unusually high pain or low pain thresholds. And these differences in moderate or heightened forms are not necessarily disabling. However, these can become a disability if a person is unable to shift attention away from sensory to other cognitive abilities or information. This inability can be due to preferences or the volume of the information, unusual perception, or pain. I'm going to talk about attention and memory together, but they're considered separate domains. Sustained attention, or the ability to focus attention for long periods of time, is a socially valued trait that helps people better understand their social and non-social environment. Clearly, being unable to sustain attention would be disabling. But the inability to shift attention can also be disabling. Increased memory helps people learn from their environment and actions. We can all agree that decreased memory can hamper learning. But what about increased memory? I propose that increased memory and attention, when they go outside of certain parameters, can disrupt developmental timing and act synergistically in development. And I'm going to use language development as an example. So infants are geniuses when it comes to learning language. They don't really, need a lot of direct instruction to learn it. They kind of just learn it on their own, just being exposed to it. But in order to do this, infants need constraints on memory and attention to learn language. It helps them identify phonemes, which are the smallest parts of language. And Jenny Safran's work uses the example pretty baby. And if somebody says, "Oh, what a pretty baby," there's no pauses between these words. In fact, it can be very difficult to know how to parse where one word ends and begins. Fix that, okay. So I'm going to continue. But infants perform probabilistic learning to determine what sounds go together to form words. So for example, in English, we have a lot of E sounds at the end of words. Pretty, baby, doggy, kitty, so these E sounds. We don't have very many ba sounds at the end of words. So no pre-ba or T-ba or, other kinds of ba sounds. So the likelihood that one sound follows the other informs this probabilistic learning that infants are doing. And it relies on some very interesting constraints. It is relying on the fact that these infants have very tiny attention spans and very limited memories. And it is allowing them to focus the attention on small segments to be able to perform this probabilistic learning. And adult brains just can't do this. Our attention and memory are too large. So we can learn huge chunks of information, but we're not able to break it down into the very fine, high resolution probabilities that infants are doing. So I can learn this phrase, sono contente di averti conosciuto, which, is one of a very few phrases I know in Italian. The little I do know, I speak very badly. But I know it means it's nice to meet you. And I can use that whole sentence. But I don't really know how to use these words flexibly. I can change one word in it. I can say, sono contente di averti telefonato. And, the first one meant it's nice to meet you. And the second one means I'm glad you called. So I'm able to chunk these large, bits of information, but I'll never be able to parse the language into the fine-grained resolution like an infant. And so I will never speak Italian like a native speaker. But infants with increased attention and memory do not even have the prior experience with a language to inform how to use the language. And so what we may see in autism with increased attention and memory is this echolalia, or speaking in full, phrases without seeming to understand them. I propose that it takes time, it takes these infants with increased memory and attention a long time to develop the physical capacity to say these large chunks. But by the time they have that physical capacity, they're speaking in these whole phrases that they appear not to understand. So you say, do you want a cookie? And the child responds, do you want a cookie? And we call that echolalia and pronoun reversal. And we call it a lot of things. But it could just as simply be that the child is babbling in these whole phrases, trying to figure out what it means. So the behaviors that we sometimes see where the child is memorizing whole movies may speak to this intense attention and memory. But these children do not have the prior experiences they need to be able to, on their own, to break this information down into the smaller components to make it easier to learn the content and meaning of these words. So non-social orientation. All people observe their environment. They observe both the social environment and the non-social environment. But most young children prioritize social information. Social information is very important for learning from others. If you're familiar with Vygotskian learning, it's this idea that learning for humans is socially mediated, and a good deal of it certainly is. Orienting to social information is crucial for learning communication and social interactions, and it forms a foundational skill for learning how to imitate. But children with BAPCO personalities prefer non-social information. And non-social information helps us learn how this non-social world operates. And Piaget, another learning theorist, describes how young children, how young children will manipulate objects and observe the object world in order to better understand concepts. So, and people, this preference for non-social information likely underlie our motivations for the arts and sciences, our innovations in tool use, and more. Having an extreme personality that intends exclusively to the social environment, the social information, would make it very difficult to learn non-social information. And the same thing in reverse, paying attention to the object information in one's environment and paying attention to it exclusively would make it extremely difficult to learn the social information needed for social interaction and communication. So systemizing really comes from the work of Dr. Simon Baron-Cohen. He has a new book out called Pattern Seekers, and he's done a tremendous job of highlighting how this attribute can operate in autism. And he also talks about how this attribute is foundational for the creation of human civilization. He and I conceptualize systemizing a bit differently, but that's a talk for another day. It can be hard to imagine what non-systemizing might look like because it's so embedded in things that we do. But I propose that non-systemizing is simply the in-the-moment action and reaction. People do this socially and non-socially all the time, but it's an easy example. If you think about somebody, you see something funny out in the environment and you just laugh. You laugh without reflecting, right? We do this all the time. Systemizing, on the other hand, involves how we organize information in our world. And it relies on everything that underlies our ability to question. It is our questions of what and why, where, when, how, and other questions. So imagine, if you will, laughing automatically at something and then wondering, why is that funny? So systemizing underlies our conscious rules relating to social and non-social environments. It underlies our laws, our sciences, our arts, and so much more. But behaviors relating to systemizing may underlie anxiety and other conditions. Rumination may simply be a long string of, why did that happen that way? And it may underlie a need to re-examine fine details. And then obviously, low systemizing would result in great difficulty learning and understanding. And so I'm describing how BAPCO can relate to development. You can have these different constellation of traits, but as you increase the intensity or the clustering of constellations of any of these traits, we may get different combinations that create different developmental pathways. And these preferences may affect development early. So the more attention spent on non-social information means less time learning social information. And the more time spent non-conforming means less time imitating. So I've talked about how education and occupational opportunities for men and women can lead to assortative mating, resulting in offspring with BAPCO personalities, and that these in some cases you can have the assortative mating and BAPCO personalities leading to extreme traits or certain trait clusters that may result in autism. But now I'd like to take a walk through the lower half of this model. Specifically, I'd like to talk about how BAPCO personalities can co-occur with another disability to result in autism. And this brings me to what I call the BAPCO disability matrix paradigm. Autism is associated with a huge range of risk factors that includes prenatal risk factors, perinatal risk factors, and postnatal risk factors. And all of these factors are also related to other disabilities. Different risk factors may create specific challenges for development. And I'm not going to talk about all of these factors that you see scrolling across the screen, but I do want to bring your attention to this main takeaway, which is the sheer number of risk factors associated with autism. Similarly, autism is associated with an increased risk of co-occurring conditions, such as developmental disabilities, genetic syndromes, mental health conditions, physical health conditions. In fact, only 15% of 8-year-olds with autism have no identified co-occurring condition. Yet, that leaves 85% of autistic children and adults with at least one co-occurring condition. Each of these conditions and combinations of conditions may create different developmental pathways. So a person might ask themselves, what is going on with autism? Why are there so many co-occurring conditions, genetic, neurological, developmental, mental health, physical health? Why is autism more common with factors related to developmental disabilities? Well, I'm asking, what if the presence of risk factors and co-occurring conditions simply interact with a BAPCO personality? So this brings us to the BAPCO DMAP. On the left side here, describing the rows, is the disability category, without and with a co-occurring disability. And at the top, describing the columns, is the degree of BAPCO traits, low and high. I'm proposing that if an individual, who doesn't have a co-occurring disability, has a low BAPCO personality or a high BAPCO personality, these are just people. We might call them, charming or evolutionists. However, if an individual has a co-occurring disability, and they have a low BAPCO personality, we would just describe them with that disability. So we would say, Johnny has Fragile X, or Jose has an information processing disability. But if an individual has a high BAPCO personality and a co-occurring disability, we call that combination of personality and disability autism. So what I am proposing is that autism is a combination of these socially valued traits, all of these constellations combined with a range of co-occurring disabilities. And so we have this huge range of pathways that a person can go down to receive a diagnosis of autism, which explains, those levels of support that we were talking about. And it certainly explains the huge range of heterogeneity that we see in autism. So I call autism a Schrödinger of a diagnosis because autism simultaneously is and is not a thing. Science keeps treating it as a thing when instead it has many pathways. It has these combinations, these constellations of personality and co-occurring conditions, and it has many pathways related to risk and development. So at this point, I've covered the whole model. I've described how education and occupational opportunities for males and females create opportunities for assortative mating that can lead to BAPCO personalities. I also described how offspring can have extreme BAPCO personalities or constellations that result in autism. Finally, I described how BAPCO personalities can combine with a co-occurring disability and result in a combination that we call autism. Or for those with low BAPCO personalities, we would describe that just by the occurring developmental disability. And this is a testable theory. One hypothesis is that multiplex families, those are families with multiple members who have an autism diagnosis, should have greater representation of BAPCO constellations. They may also have more disabilities that co-occur with autism. Societies that do not provide freedom for assortative mating should have a lower prevalence of BAPCO personalities and autism. Orthodox and traditional societies who place less value on innovation, nonconformity, or meritorious activities should have a lower prevalence of BAPCO and autism. Oops. Societies, however, that value BAPCO for males but not females should have an intermediate prevalence of BAPCO and autism, and societies that value BAPCO for both males and females should have the highest prevalence of BAPCO and autism. Also, specific BAPCO trait constellations in parents may lead to specific developmental pathways. So in this presentation, I have addressed the big questions in autism. What is autism? Autism is extreme BAPCO traits or BAPCO with a co-occurring disability. Why is it so heterogeneous? Well, BAPCO describes a constellation of traits, and BAPCO can co-occur with a huge range of disabilities. Why is the prevalence changing? There have been historic changes in education and occupation for males and females that have led to assortative mating that can create subpopulations. And the increased opportunities for women, which started sort of around the 60s and began to increase from the 70s onward to today, have really can really accelerate the prevalence. And this brings us to the big question: what should we do about autism? One of the things that we need to do is create a measure of BAPCO. We need to shift our science to include a combination of beneficial and detrimental traits. If we expand our autism to be more holistic, then we have more complete and accurate descriptions that can lead to better research. This theory also has implications related to research investigating the cause, cure, and prevention of autism. It may alter how we research causes. There may need to be more emphasis on co-occurring conditions, particularly when we talk about things like prevention or cures or treatment. BAPCO as a personality cannot be cured, and likely it can't be prevented, because ethics. But the prevalence of these traits could change if we had extreme changes in our social values. But then we have to ask ourselves, what do we do about extreme BAPCO personalities? And as far as personalities go, any personality trait that is unchecked is a disorder. So what do we do about individuals who have great difficulty in being able to rein in certain aspects of their personality or psychological processes? But in order to really understand what we're seeing in children with autism and to understand what is going on in children, We need more emphasis on BAPCO profiles and developmental pathways. It's possible that some individuals may be able to shift from autism to BAPCO depending on the degree to which their co-occurring disabilities can be addressed, or the degree to which an individual may be able to grow into self-regulation skills to be able to rein in certain aspects of their personality. But even if a person didn't have a disability, even if they're not technically autistic, we may be categorizing some folks who would, in a way just have regular old BAPCO personality as autism, simply because they're facing intolerance and discrimination. And there are also people that do not meet the criteria for autism who are also experiencing poor outcomes related to their lower preference for social activities and behaviors, and possibly their tendencies to engage in nonconformity. It's also possible that the social values of their traits may not be emphasized enough. And so you may be shoulder to shoulder with people that you think are quite odd, who you think might fit a BAPCO personality or a social a social difference. But you might be going shoulder to shoulder with people that you don't recognize as being on the spectrum, because a lot of individuals engage in something called camouflaging. So they're hiding traits or preferences that come naturally to them. And this can have important health and physical health and psychological health outcomes. So that we've reached the end of my presentation. I'd like to thank Stephen Glatt, Beth Mallow, Colleen Moore, and Yvonne Lee for their critical review of the manuscript, Crystal Heron for her editorial support of the recently published manuscript. I've worked on this theory for decades, and I've been fortunate enough to receive a range of funding during this time. So that brings me to the end, and I would welcome your questions.
Great, thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. So we have one question. I'd encourage everyone to enter the questions into the Q&A. We have one question that came through. This is from Dr. Antonis Rokas. He says, great, really interesting talk. If assortative mating is driving the increased prevalence, would you predict that the frequency of autism will increase? And can you use data from the future, i.e. data on autism prevalence, that will be collected in the next few years to test your hypothesis?
Yes, actually, there's a lot of pieces to that question. So I think I'm going to open up the little chat so I can break it down a little bit. Yes, the idea is that, we should be able to predict the frequency. I think it would also be nice to use some computational modeling for this as well, partly because there may be there might be upper limits for the drift, but it's an unusual question. I think we live in really unusual times in terms of the kinds of characteristics that we're selecting for in our environments, and I'm not positive, how to predict where it's going to go, how extreme it can go in terms of the intensity of the traits. But I think we can test the hypotheses in terms of, looking at changes in certain societies. So we know that in Israel, for example, we have some subgroups of people that have immigrated in. And for example, we would expect as they immigrate in to have a lower prevalence of BAPCO, but as they assimilate more into that society, we might be able to look at how the rate of change in diagnoses might occur over time.
Sorry, great. So I'm going to ask a question that I know you really didn't talk about, but I just wanted to sort of give the opportunity for you to touch on this, which is, often there's a societal misconception that the increase in autism is due to some increase in vaccinations or something to that effect. And obviously, I'm sure this is something you've come across. And so could you just maybe speak to that a little bit and why that's not even something that we should consider, and sort of your opinion on this?
So one of the things is that most of the mechanisms by which we would think of something like vaccinations as causing autism. So they looked at mercury. I used to be able to rattle off the names of the ingredients, but I can't anymore. There's been enough research where, you know, they've taken those ingredients out in one population and didn't see a decrease in their rates of autism. In fact, their rates of autism have increased at the same rate as ours, and Canada's one nation in particular where a study's come out with that. I think, though, and this might be an unpopular idea in science, but I think it's an important one. There are individuals who can have sensitivities to vaccines, right? We know that there are certain individuals with health conditions that might not, that leave them vulnerable to issues around vaccines. But these are also individuals that would have particular sensitivities if they came in contact with the conditions that those vaccines are trying to prevent, right? So if you have autoimmune disorders, if you have other types of things that potentially lead to a reaction, the reaction you're likely to get with, you know, a full-on virus is pretty high. So I'm definitely pro-vaccine. But one of the things that this model does is it accounts for those environmental factors. So as you notice, there's so many pathways that a person could have a diagnosis of autism. It could be extreme traits, but it could be just a regular personality. I'd like to think of this a little bit in terms of like the sort of spoon theory. So if you have a BAPCO personality and you're focusing in on the typical environment or the object environment, right? You're not really looking at the social world. And in general, you might have grown up and been, you know, this BAPCO personality. But if you have another disability, if you've been exposed to lead, if you've been exposed to any number of environmental toxins or other kinds of things that we know are associated with developmental disabilities, then you already are not devoting this amount of your attention to the social world, but now you've got a disability that's also taking up your attentional resources and your physical resources. So it creates a collective vulnerability toward these behaviors that we see in autism, this reduced communication, socialization, and unusual behaviors.
Great, thank you. So we have another question from Abigail Labella, and she asks, have you investigated changes in allele frequencies in SNPs associated with BAPCO traits over time, and do you see a higher prevalence in these SNPs in younger versus older generations?
I love this question. I've just been in, Dr. John Constantino and I have been talking about ways to do this. He has this twin studies database, you know, so that we can look at identical and fraternal twins and multiplex families. And we are talking about developing a BAPCO scale so that we can then be able to examine exactly what you're talking about in these multiplex and twin studies.
Excellent, thank you. And so I also had a question. So if you know, different societies, different types of mating are potentially leading to prevalence of autism, do you see indications of this based on societies that are quite different or historically have had differences in whether it's arranged marriages or not arranged marriages or just opportunities or even the BAPCO personality traits, for example?
So right now, when we look at autism prevalence across countries, there's a lot of confounds. And so one confound, for example, is stigma. So if you have families that do not want to be associated with anything related to an autism diagnosis, then they're underreporting autism, right? So the question is it truly, you know, a lower prevalence, or is it a lower prevalence related to stigma? And you can see how in societies that value conformity, that, you know, that's going to be an empirical question, and it's going to be a tricky one to tease out. But I think there are ways to do that.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So I just wanted to, at this point, just say thank you very much to Dr. McDonald for giving this talk. It was really a refreshing and interesting to, kind of what we had hoped with the whole evolution initiative is to sort of these ideas with an evolutionary perspective. So really wonderful. So thank you so much. I also wanted to invite you to join us for a reception. We'll start at 4:15 and there's a link in the chat. So thank you again, and we'll see those of you in a few minutes.